a real pleasure to be back in Virginia and to be considered an honorary Virginian. I owe a treasure. Thank you. This is probably the more challenging talk I've ever given because I want to, like as you can tell now, I'm a farmer philosopher, and when you're a farmer philosopher, you tend to look at issues not only from a very practical perspective of how is this going to really work out on my own farm, but also from the broader philosophical issues, so the kind of big picture issues. And to do that in 30 minutes and try to put it all together, as is my challenge here, is not going to be easy. So I'm going to do some of this rather rapidly, and it's not going to have the kind of detail that it deserves. But you can always get in touch with me, and we can carry on the conversation. I will be here, the rest of the day, and happy to have conversations with you as well. So first of all, I want to raise this question: well, what is the it that that we want to put together here now? And I think that one of the, and this is the philosophical part of my thinking, one of the kinds of tendencies that we have as a human species is to simplify issues as much as we can. Am I doing things wrong here? Okay. And so, we've heard a lot of, and I unfortunately wasn't able to be here yesterday, but I know some of the people who made presentations, so I have a pretty good idea what they presented, and then also today, and some really, really great information. But the kind of thing for me that was missing in so much of it, which is not a criticism at all, it's a description of where most of us are at. When we deal with these kinds of issues and problems, we tend to try to oversimplify. So there's sort of the implication that, if everybody just went organic, well then we'd solve all our problems there and we'd be fine. Or if everybody just went local, we'd solve all the problems there and be fine. Or certainly if everybody practiced the kind of environmental stewardship that we should have, then everything would be fine. Or on the other side of the issue, there is really two stories now about how to do these problems, solve these problems simply. And that is that if everybody just intensified what we've been doing for the last 50 years, just look how successful we've been, then we'll solve all our problems. We'll feed those 9 billion people and everything will turn out okay. And I think that's a problem. Now, there are a few voices that have raised a question around this, and one of them, in terms of organic, is Anne Clark, who's an agroecologist at Guelph University in Canada. And she published a paper here a couple of years ago, which was entitled "The Future is Organic, but It's More Than Organic." And she simply looked at what we're doing as organic farmers now in the context of the kind of new energy challenges that we're going to face in the future. So simply looking at that one innovation that we're going to see in the future. And then she pointed out, the number of things that we're currently doing in organic is not going to work in our new economic, in our new energy situation. And so we have to now begin to transform our organic agriculture to meet these new challenges in the future in terms of energy. And then, already back in the late 1970s, Wendell Berry wrote an article called "Solving for Pattern," and that article was then published later in his book, "The Gift of Good Land." And if you don't read anything, if you haven't read that essay and you don't read anything else of the resources that I'm going to suggest today, I would hope that you would look at that, because it was such a brilliant piece, and it's a short piece, like 6.5 pages. But what Wendell pointed out is that we always tend to try to solve problems as isolated problems. But that never works, because in the first place, you don't solve the problem, and a lot of times you, in fact, create the problem that you're trying to solve, because problems don't exist in isolation. They exist in the real world, which is a complex, evolving, constantly emerging world. And so we have to solve problems in terms of their interconnections, and to solve for pattern. And so I think that's just to give you one example of that, if you have a problem like pests, how do you solve that? Well, you bring in a pesticide, right? It's solving as an individual incident. But what you do then, of course, is you never just kill the pest. You also kill some other biological organisms that previously served to help keep pests in check, so you actually cause pest resurgence. So to some extent, you create the problem that you're trying to solve. And then, of course, you also develop pest resistance, which creates additional problems. So in order to try to understand, to place all of these issues that we've talked about and the solutions to these issues, I want to put this in a little bit historical context, because I think to put them in historical context, to understand how we got to this point where we're constantly trying to solve these problems as isolated problems is important, I think, for us to understand. And the first of these is, and this goes back 3 centuries with the Enlightenment. And what the Enlightenment did really was to free us from the Middle Ages, but it led us to believe that we are separate from nature, we're somehow special as a human species, that we have a responsibility to control and manage nature, that we are in charge, or as old Leopold once put it, we like to think that we are the conquerors of the land community rather than simply plain members and citizens. So this is a very deeply embedded culture in our thinking now, and this is how we think we need to do this. And if you just think about a few of the people that framed those issues back then, like René Descartes, who said we have to become the masters and possessors of nature, or Francis Bacon, who said we have to bend nature to our will, right? And so it led us to believe that we are this kind of special species within the Earth community, and that we can do whatever we need to do, and we can always force nature to do what we want it to do. And so we tend to then look at problems as simplified problems, which we can correct simply by exercising our force upon it. And then following, of course, closely on the heels of the Enlightenment movement was the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution, and I think it's important to remember that what really stimulated the Industrial Revolution was the discovery of fossil fuels. You know, it was coal and then oil and then natural gas, which really gave us that cheap energy to do all of these things, to dominate nature and to make it do what we wanted it to do. But we then arrived at this in all of our economies, whether you're a farmer or making or manufacturing automobiles or computers or whatever else you're doing. The single goal is maximum efficient production for short-term economic return, right? If you want to be successful, that's what you have to do. Now, if you think about that, maximum efficient production for short-term economic return, there isn't anything in that paradigm about sustainability. It's all about making as much money as you can in the short term, on the assumption that if you do that, then you're going to be successful. Now, how do you do that? How do you maximize efficient production for short-term economic return? Well, it's simple. You specialize. That's the way you get more efficiency. You simplify your management, because complex systems take more time. And you go for economies of scale. And so if you think about and the interesting thing about agriculture is agriculture adopted these industrial principles really not on a full scale until after the Second World War. It started to emerge earlier than that. But by the Second World War, we really started moving in that direction. And so now, whether you're in Virginia or Iowa or California, what do you see on the landscape? You see maximum efficient production for short-term economic return, the specialization, simplification of management, and economies of scale. You know, in Iowa now, 92% of our cultivated land is just 2 crops, corn and soybeans. That's what we got to, So it's those kinds of specialized monocultures now, which every farmer is put in the position of producing as much as possible through this way. As a matter of fact, Paul Thompson, a friend of mine who's another fellow philosopher, he once in one of his books, The Secret of the Soil, he said that farmers are now put into an ethical box of operating on one set of ethical principles, and that is to produce as much as possible, regardless of the cost. And so this is the philosophical operation, the ethical framework, out of which all of us are forced to operate now. So, have we been successful in this? And of course, nobody would argue that we haven't been successful in meeting this goal. And we have increased the yields of a few crops, doubled, tripled, in some instances quadrupled just in the last 50 years. And so naturally, we look at this and we have this tendency, well, if we just do more of that, then we're going to be okay. The problem with this is that we are now moving into a future in which these resources which we have had to sustain this kind of economy is simply not going to be there. And Herman Daly, who I'm sure many of you know, he already began to recognize this 35 years ago when he was still with the World Bank. And he came up with this idea. He said, and he tried to convince his fellow economists that we needed to fundamentally change the way we do things now. That still hasn't happened. So this is one of the challenges that I want to share with all of you as we think about the future together. But Herman Daly told his fellow economists, he says, the problem here is that where we're operating our human economy now is like a bubble floating in space with unlimited natural resources going in to fuel that bubble and unlimited sinks in nature to absorb its waste. And he was arguing this day is rapidly coming to a close now because we're using up the natural resources and the sinks are being saturated. And so what we have to do now is redesign our human economies to be subsystems of the ecosystem of which they are really a part and operate within those constraints and within those limits. Now, Herman Daly still is not being recognized as somebody that we ought to be paying attention to. The good news part of this is that there is now a new society of professionals, the Society of Ecological Economics, which are doing some incredible work, helping us to think in practical ways. A new book is going to be coming out quite shortly by Rob Dietz, who's one of those professionals. And the title of his book is Enough is Enough. And I've had a chance to read the manuscript, and I can tell you it's a very practical approach now of how we need to rethink of our economy, and in fact have a better quality of life if we do that. So these are some big challenges, and I would urge all of us to look at this as part of the context in which we have to think about all these great things, these great ideas that we've been sharing today. It's part of putting all of this together. So what are these resources that we're using up? And one of the things Herman Daly is saying now is that this whole notion of unlimited growth, we just can't continue to maintain that fiction because you can't do that. So what are some of these? Resources that we've had that we've been able to use in an almost limited way? Well, first of all, we've had cheap energy, right? And we know that era is over now. When I was a high school student, I could take my car and drive up to a gas station and get gas for 20 cents a gallon. I don't think anybody believes that era is coming back. And that isn't just due to inflation. It's due to the fact that we're now using up the real transition we have to make with regard to energy is from stored concentrated energy, which is very efficient, to diffuse current energy, which is sunlight energy. That's the transition we have to make. And that the alternative energy is never going to be as efficient and therefore as cheap as the stored concentrated energy was. So the era of cheap energy is over. The era of surplus minerals, rock phosphate and potassium, which we have had in almost unlimited supplies, we're not drawing that down. We now only have 4 countries that still have rock phosphate reserves and only 4 countries that still have potassium reserves. So we are now using those reserves primarily to provide the synthetic inputs for the fertility for our soil in order to have all of this great production that we've had. And as every farmer knows who uses these resources, the cost of phosphorus, et cetera, is going up. And so you have people now that are looking at this and trying to figure out how do we begin to do this? How do we begin to and part of Michael Clare, who's written a book called The Race for What's Left, and he makes a very compelling case for the kind of future that we could be moving into now, is how we all, each country, each nation, begins to position itself to grab those resources for themselves, and that could lead us into a future of resource wars, which is certainly not a very Homo sapien way of approaching the future. So we all need to become engaged and involved in how we're going to deal with that. Another one of those resources that we've had in almost unlimited supplies of the plants is fresh water, and we've been using up our fresh water resources all across the planet. 70% of our fresh water is now used just for agricultural irrigation. And one of the reasons we're using that much fresh water is because we've used all of these other approaches to maintaining our productivity and haven't paid attention to restoring the biological health of our soil. And it's healthy biological soil which enables us to absorb and retain more moisture from rainwater, so we don't need so much irrigation. In fact, some of my colleagues who are researching this now are figuring that if we restored the biological health of our soil from, like, say, 1% organic matter to 5% organic matter, and not all soils can be done, it depends what you start with, but if we did that, we could reduce our irrigation water by a factor of 6 just by making that transition. But we're not doing that. And so currently, in fact, there was an article in Harper's Magazine this last July called The Broken Heartland, looking just at the Ogallala Aquifer, which of course provides the irrigation water for croplands all across the heartland from southern South Dakota down to Texas. And we know, of course, that we've drawn down the Ogallala Aquifer by half since 1960. What I didn't know until I read this article, which they've researched this now, we're still now drawing it down at the rate of 6 to 8 feet a year. So they're projecting that 20 years from now, which is not a long time in the future, the Ogallala Aquifer will no longer have water for irrigation. So the whole central part of the United States will no longer be able to produce annual crops. At best, it might be able to turn it into grass and raise some livestock according to their projections. So these are all issues that, that we have to think about. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room, of course, is climate. Wherever you all think climate change is, whether you believe in it or don't believe in it, the pattern that we're seeing is, of course, exactly what the climatologists have been telling us, is that we're going to have more floods, more droughts, more severe weather events. And we're starting to see that, take place already. The thing they probably got wrong was the speed at which this is going to happen. Now, every farmer certainly knows that ultimately the success of a farm depends on the weather. And if we start to have this kind of future where we can't depend on the kind of stable climates that we've had in the past, then how's that going to affect? How then are we going to be, quote, sustainable? And then, of course, as I've said, we've lost these virgin soils, etc. And so we really have to rethink. And then the saturated sinks, of course, there are two primary things which help us understand what's happening here. The one, of course, is the dead zones. It's projected now that we probably have about 1,000 dead zones, and they're all connected with agricultural systems. We can't continue to do that on into the future, and we're externalizing these costs. We're not absorbing them ourselves. If every farmer in the Mississippi Valley had to pay for the cost of cleaning up the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, it would put us all out of business. But it is affecting the shrimpers and the other fisheries in the Gulf and harming them economically, and so they're not going to be able to do that indefinitely into the future. And the other, of course, aspect that helps us understand the saturation, of course, is what we're doing to the atmosphere. It's interesting to me that in all of our public discussions about energy, nobody hardly ever mentions the first or second laws of thermodynamics, which are central. The first law of thermodynamics is that you can neither create nor destroy energy, so the amount of energy is constant. And the second law is the law of entropy. And while you can't create or destroy energy, you can take energy from one system, put it into another system, and then it always transforms out of that into another system. And the more specialized your system is, the more energy will flow through the system. So what's creating our problem now with climate change is that the energy that we take out of the soil in the form of fossil fuels to use for our agriculture, that energy then flows into the atmosphere in the form of greenhouse gases. So the energy is still there, but we can't use it anymore the way we used it before. And what's happening now is what my colleagues at least refer to biospheric entropy, and that is that it is now creating this situation which is causing the global warming, which now, of course, has a very negative effect in terms of our agriculture. So, I don't have a lot of time now, and I'm going to have some good news for you here. So, because I'm sure that none of us get very energized by saying, "Oh my God, we got all these problems. What are we going to do?" The thing we have to recognize, I think, is that this is a time now not for just making things a little less bad. It's not a time to think about sustainability in terms of greening things up. It's a time for really thinking about transformations. What kind of new systems are we going to put in place now that are going to enable us to have productive, healthy food systems given these new circumstances? And this is not an easy challenge, and it's going to require the collective action of all of us as we move forward with this. And here's where you begin on some of the good news. We have a number of individuals now who have done some writing that I want to call to your attention that begin to help us understand how we start moving in this new direction. One of them is Michael Porter and his colleague Mark Kramer. And they published an article in the Harvard Business Review, the January-February issue of 2011, entitled Creating Shared Value. And Michael Porter points out that we are now at a point where if you want to be successful in business, now remember again, Michael Porter is probably the leading economist in the United States, perhaps even internationally. And for him to be saying this now, at least for me, was a very hopeful sign, because it's no longer just us crazy agriculture agrarians or environmentalists that are saying this. We now got some of our key economists that are saying this. So in his article, Creating Shared Value, what he was saying is that if you want to be successful in business in the future now, you can't do it the way you did it in the past. You can't marginalize labor and raw materials in order to add more value further up the chain, whether you're in the food business or any other kind of business. You have to now share the value across. And here, I'm going to just read to you a short quote which comes through, which sort of summarizes what he's really saying. He says, the traditional playbook, the way we've done it in the past, the traditional playbook calls for companies to commoditize and exert maximum bargaining power on suppliers to drive down prices. More recently, firms have been rapidly outsourcing to suppliers in lower wage locations. Now, everybody who's a farmer who's been paying attention knows that that's the way business has been done, right? He's saying this is the traditional playbook. Today, he says, some companies are beginning to understand that marginalized suppliers cannot remain productive or sustain, much less than improve their quality. So if you're in business and you want to be successful, you have to now share the value and make sure that everybody is doing well in the system rather than just trying to grab as much wealth out of the system for yourself. You're not going to be successful using that approach in the future. Now, he also says we have to create shared value in terms of our environmental issues and our social issues, because companies can no longer be successful by outsourcing their environmental damage or outsourcing the social issues. And some of the things we heard this morning about local economies investing more in local communities. Michael Porter is now saying that any company that wants to be successful is going to have to do that, because if you don't do that, you're not going to have the local communities, the social value of the local communities, and the economic value of the local communities in order to be successful. It's going to come in to hurt you. So you have to really rethink and share that value now. The economic value, the social value, and the environmental value have to be shared together. So a second individual which did also wrote an article in April of 2011 is Jeremy Grantham. Now Jeremy Grantham is probably not, I didn't know about Jeremy Grantham. A former student of mine called his attention to me. But Jeremy Grantham runs an organization, a company, that advises investors. So if you have money and you want to make money on your money, Jeremy Grantham is one of the people you want to pay attention to. He advises a group of investors that invest somewhere around $400 billion a year. So this is not a small investment firm. And Jeremy Grantham is now and he wrote this article, and he does a newsletter, I think Porter did. And in his April newsletter, the title of which was Time to Wake Up. The day of unlimited natural resources and cheap prices are over forever. So he's saying, if you want to be successful as an investor now, you can't just look at those things like those natural resources which could be made available on a large scale and add value to it in order to make your money on your money. You have to now invest in the whole system. And he even says such things, which seems like almost bizarre, that you have to invest in soil if you want to be successful in the future. So this is another kind of transformation in the investment community that I at least found useful. Okay, another individual that has provided us, I think, with some important information as we think about the future is Joseph Stiglitz, which I would imagine is known to most of you. He's one of our leading economists in the country. He's come out with a new book now entitled The Price of Inequality. And it's an amazing study in great detail that if we don't begin to recreate our economies in ways that share the wealth in the economy, then we're simply not going to have any kind of restored economy. It cannot happen. because, and he points this out very, very clearly. Again, I can't go into detail here, but if you're interested in this, I would invite you to read his book. So here we are. We have to begin to invest now in our natural capital. We have to invest in our social capital if we want our financial capital to be successful. That's the basic story behind all of this. I think that addresses a lot of the issues that I'm hearing all of us talk about here. And then there's a couple of articles, one by John Canna and again Mark Kramer, both of them being at Stanford University. And they've written an essay called Collective Impact. And this gets to this collaboration kind of point. The point that they make in this short essay is that what we have to do now, if we really want to address all of these problems and issues that we're talking about now, is that we have to have collective impact. And by that, they didn't just mean that we have to start talking to each other and communicate with each other, which is, for some people, what collaboration means. It means that we really have to begin, people in business, people in nonprofit organizations, farmers and others, have to begin to plan together and work together and act together to really look at these things, solving for pattern within the regions that we live in if we're going to really be successful. And they point out in their article that there are now a number of major foundations like the Pew Charitable Trust who are moving in this direction because they are dissatisfied with the fact that by funding individual organizations for individual projects hasn't solved the problems. So they're now looking at how to find these collective impact approaches that they can fund and support. Those of us, any of us who are dependent upon on grant money might want to pay attention to that. Again, I would invite you to read their article. And then there are a number of people now that are beginning to write and do research and explore options and possibilities in terms of how we redesign our farming systems. You know, and up to now, our thinking has been, and we know that there are a lot of environmental problems. Nobody needs to make that case anymore. But there are kind of, again, two schools of thought here. One is that we have to intensify our current agriculture so that we produce more so that we can save, you know, some of the natural resources that we're trying to preserve. So that's one kind of approach. Well, there's a new kind of approach that's emerging now. And Yvette Perfecto and her colleagues in this book, Nature's Matrix, is probably one of as good an example that I know of that talks about this alternative approach where we can use agriculture to produce biodiversity and they give a lot of this has been happening in the global south. They give a number of cases that demonstrate where this is done and how it's being done. So in other words, again, it's transforming, moving from our monocultures to more complex systems that not only provide more food, but also provide the kind of biodiversity that we need to sustain, you know, our natural capital and our natural systems. Now, at the heart of all of this is, from my perspective anyway, that has to be on the front line for all of us, is restoring the biological health of our soil and to the fullest extent possible, preserving the biodiversity and genetic diversity we still have left and restore that. Because the soil is foundational. It's not only that we can reduce our dependence on irrigation water, but we can reduce our dependence on fertility, etc. So we have all of these possibilities of beginning to address the long-term solutions to these problems that we're all facing to restore the biological health of our soil. And we know how to do that. There's wisdom from the past that tells us exactly how to do that. And it's primarily that we have to now begin figuring out the way, as much as possible, to return our wastes back into the soil. And you know, we sometimes still think of soil simply as dirt, and it's not. Soil is a living community. That living community needs that those resources in order to sustain itself. Okay, so here's the good news, and I'm going to do this very quickly. Part of what the good news here is that we have what I like to call some beacons out there that are already showing us the direction we need to go in. And I like to use the term beacons rather than models, because models is, you know, when you heard Francis Ticky yesterday, who's a good friend of mine, Francis is one of those beacons. You know, here's a farmer who has put together a system. And the reason I don't want to call him a model, because that models you think, well, all I got to do is do the same thing that Francis is doing in my farm, wherever it is. I can't do what Francis is doing in my farm in North Dakota because it's a different ecology. But he's a beacon in the sense that he has demonstrated how you can put a system together that's very low energy use, that restores the biological health of the soil, that provides all of these, that has already made that kind of transformation. So how can I use him as a beacon to invent what I need to invent on my farm in North Dakota? And there are fortunately a lot of farmers all over the world, most of them small scale. One of the things we need to do with research is to figure out how to scale their systems up. So that's one kind of resource. Another group of beacons come from some of our researchers. We really have some researchers now who have recognized that this way we've been doing things in the past and simply doing research for more technology to keep doing what we're doing is not going to solve the problems of the future. We have to transform the system. And so we have people like Matt Liebman, who some of you probably know now because after 9 years of research, when Mark Bittman did an article in the New York Times about him, suddenly, he's gotten national recognition. Before that, he wasn't even getting recognition at Iowa State University. But what Matt has done is, in 9 years of research now, he has demonstrated how if you go from a 2-crop rotation, like corn and soybeans, which is typical farming in Iowa, to either a 3-crop or a 4-crop rotation, 4-crop rotation being corn, soybeans, and then a small grain and 2 years of alfalfa, you could reduce your pesticide use by 90%. You could reduce your fertilizer use by almost 90%. You use a modest amount of livestock manure, and your return to land and labor is actually slightly higher than in the 2-crop rotation. Now, this is the kind of research that we need to be doing when we start thinking about the kind of transformations we have to make. Now, farmers aren't automatically going to go out and say, oh, wow, Matt's done this research, I'm going to go to a 4-crop rotation. Because what a farmer in Iowa will tell you is, what the hell am I going to do with the alfalfa? I can't take it to an elevator and sell it. We have to transform the marketing infrastructure in order for these applications. But at least if we have that information, we know the direction to move in. Another quick beacon, some of you probably know, is Wes Jackson at the Land Institute, who's now been doing 30 years of research on how to transform annual crops to perennial crops. If you have a perennial crop, like perennial wheat, for example, your root system goes down to the ground 15 to 18 feet instead of 15 to 18 inches. You got a drought year like we have this year, and that root system can pull that moisture from deeper in the ground. You're going to be much more resilient than you are with the annual crops. These deep-rooted crops, rooted systems, also provide the kind of habitat for all of those organisms in the soil, so that you begin to restore the biological health of the soil. You reduce your input, your energy input, because you don't plant every year, you plant maybe every 5 or 6 years. So there's enormous benefits from this kind of, and this kind of research needs to be promoted more. Wes has come up with his 50-year farm bill as a way how we could all begin to invest in this in the future. And 50 years from now, his scientists have projected that 60% of our annual crops could be in perennials 50 years from now. So that's another part of the good news that we have. Okay, we have a food revolution that's going on in London, and you're all aware of that, so I'm not going to have to go into a lot of detail, but food hubs now, where people are beginning to recognize that they want more say in their foods, and they want to know where their food comes from, all of these things we heard about today. And these food hubs now are evolving in a way where people want food sovereignty. They want to make the decisions, working with farmers in terms of how they put a food system together. Now they're no longer passive recipients, they become active food citizens. And this is an enormously important kind of human capital that we're having given to us as a gift. And it's that kind of, if we want to have this collective impact, then these are the kinds of relationships that we need to encourage and develop. We also have health professionals now who are becoming engaged around food and agriculture issues, because health professionals now know that no matter what kind of healthcare system we have, it's not going to be affordable into the future unless we deal with the sources of the problems of illness and disease, rather than simply coming in with a therapeutic intervention. And so, so we now have a number of healthcare professionals, particularly in the public health arena, who are reaching out and recognizing that soil and food and health are intimately connected, something that Sir Robert Howard understood already 100 years ago. And we now have healthcare professionals at the Johns Hopkins School of Health, for example, who are working with soil scientists to do some peer-reviewed research to help us better understand what those connections are, and therefore how we can manage our soil to have the kind of food that we need to encourage the increase of health in our, and particularly among children. So these are all very positive kinds of things that are all part of the food revolution. And then I think the fact that we have cooperative extension, we need to appreciate because these future systems meeting these kinds of challenges are going to be based on knowledge intensiveness, not technology intensive. And knowledge intensive exactly what our cooperative extension is. Now, unfortunately, we've kind of reached a point, I think, in our systems where we think that cooperative extension isn't relevant anymore because private companies are doing the technology transfer, which cooperative extension is to do. But I want to say to you that cooperative extension is going to be more important in the next 50 years than they've been in their entire history, because they are the ones who can help us, work with us in our communities in terms of the kind of knowledge that we need to incorporate now as we make these transitions. Okay, last thing is an emerging new culture. This is the last part of this good news. You know, although Leopold already told us 100 years ago that we are not the conquerors of the land community, we're simply paying members and citizens. So we have to understand and learn how we're a part of that rich biotic community, everything from microbes to earthworms to mammals. I mean, we're all a part of it. And if the whole thing isn't healthy, none of it's going to be healthy. Now, that idea in Leopold has been largely ignored until now. Now we're starting to see some interesting publications coming out. And one of them that I will again recommend to all of you is a new book that Marjorie Kelly has come out with called Owning Our Future. And she argues that we now need to move out of what she calls an extractive economy, where each of us tries to extract as much wealth as we can for our own benefit, right, for our own welfare. And we have to now move to what she calls a generative economy. This is an economy in which we work together to enrich the quality of life in our communities for everyone. And that the extractive economy, she argues, and for reasons, some of the reasons we heard already today, is increasingly becoming dysfunctional. And it's going to have to be in terms of these investments, in our own communities, and moving forward with that. And then we have, one of the other things is the good news is we have this new generation of young people now. And I have the privilege of working with many of them at the Stone Garden Center in New York. And I have to tell you that these are the most inspiring young people I have ever met in my life. And they are committed to all of the things we're talking about here. They want to farm. They want to do it in a way that meets all of these challenges. And they don't want to do undifferentiated commodity agriculture. They want to raise food for people. And what they need is access to land, access to affordable capital, and access to the kind of markets that can give them the kind of return that pays off their investment and gives them a decent life. That's all they ask for. We can address many of those problems as public communities and public policy. And if we don't do this, we're going to lose this gift. This is one of the great gifts given to us. We could not buy that human capital. We could not create it. But we have it as a gift, and we need to support it and store it and sustain it. And then ultimately, I think the other thing that we need to do as we try to meet all of these challenges is that we need to collaborate more with the arts. Because if people can't imagine a better life than what they have now, they're all going to try to hang on to what they got, and that's not going to get us where we need to go. The arts can help us imagine. And it's not going to be that hard to do, because all of the evidence, since we have engaged in this, what some people have called the gospel of consumption, that the more we consume, the better quality of life we have. And this has been a track we've been on at least since about the early 1970s. All of the evidence now from psychologists is that, in fact, the opposite. Our quality of life has gone down. Our rates of depression are higher. Our rates of suicide are higher. So life can be better than what we have now. So if we can make this transition to this generative economy in which we operate and work together, then we can have a better quality of life. And the artists can help us to imagine that future. And to give you one quick example of this with regard to soil, Deborah Kuntz-Garcia spent 4 years now putting together a new documentary called The Symphony of Soil. And I have to tell you that nobody is going to be able to see that documentary and still think that soil is just dirt, because she's taken some of the best artistic capabilities together with the best science and help us to understand in this hour-and-a-half documentary what soil is really all about and why it's important to us. And so these are the kinds of things that the artists can help us with to make this cultural transformation that we're going to need in order to move into the kind of future that we're going to need. Now, I don't know if that puts it all together.
It does.